Romans chapter 6, verses 1 to 5, leaving the state of sin through baptism. What are we to say then? Shall we continue in the state of sin so that grace may increase? Certainly not. We died to sin. How can we still live in it? Don't you know that all of us who were baptized into the Messiah, Jesus, were baptized into his death? That means that we were buried with him through baptism into death, so that just as the Messiah was raised from the dead through the Father's glory, we too might behave with a new quality of life. For if we have been planted together in the likeness of his death, we shall also be in the likeness of his resurrection. Everybody knows Jesus' spectacular story of the prodigal son, Luke chapter 15, verses 11 to 32. The younger son twists his father's arm for his share of the property, goes off and spends it all, and comes home, he thinks, in utter disgrace. Then, to his astonishment, he finds his father running down the road to meet him and throwing a huge party in his honor. He is welcomed back as a son, even though he doesn't deserve it, and even though his older brother grumbles. Now come forward a year or two and imagine a thought stealing unbidden into the young man's mind. Life has settled down to a reasonably humdrum existence again. His older brother tolerates having him around, more or less. His father is getting older. He remembers with a happy sigh the day he came up the road and his father came running to greet him. And he thinks, supposing I did it again? Why not help myself to enough things to survive, run away for a few weeks, and then play the penitent and come back again? Maybe I'll get another party. Absurd? Unthinkable? Don't you believe it? It's exactly what a great many people think. God will forgive me, that's his job, declared a famous philosopher 2 centuries ago. And a great many people today seem to believe that the only word the church should say to anyone is the message of forgiveness. I was asked on a radio program only the other day, surely for a church that believes in tolerance, it's going to be difficult to lay down a moral law. We must, as the phrase goes, be inclusive. We must tell people that God accepts them exactly as they are. Sometimes this is backed up with a version of what Paul has just been saying. Where sin abounded, grace abounded even more. So, the only thing to say to someone who sins is, that's fine, God loves you. I suspect that Paul had met exactly this kind of argument, probably again and again, with one difference. I doubt if anyone had seriously been proposing to him that since God's love reaches us while we are still sinners, we should stay as sinners in order that God's love may go on reaching us. I suspect he had met the line of thought in the form of people objecting to his doctrine of God's free grace. You can't go around saying that. People will think they can do what they like. In fact, as we saw in chapter 3, verse 8, some people do seem to have accused him in more or less that way. Chapter 6 is written, at one level at least, to answer this point. But it isn't only an aside, as though Paul was simply taking time out of the main flow of thought to deal with a particular problem. He uses the question, as a wrestler uses the force of his opponent's attack, to advance the main thing he wants to say. At this point, we go back not to one of Jesus' stories, but to a much larger and older one. Think of the second book in the Bible, the book Exodus. Exodus tells the story of how the children of Israel were enslaved in Egypt. God heard them crying in the misery of slavery and oppression, and God sent Moses to bring them out and away to freedom in the promised land. They came through the Red Sea, leaving behind the land of slavery and discovering a new freedom. God led them to Mount Sinai, where they were given the law. They then spent, well, somewhat longer than they had imagined, wandering round the wilderness and grumbling against God. But he continued to lead them by his own presence in the pillar of cloud and fire, until eventually they entered the land they had been given as an inheritance. This story is well enough known. What is not normally recognized is that here in Romans, Paul tells a version of the very same story, starting with this present passage. Romans chapter 6 describes how Christians come through the water of baptism, like the Red Sea, and thus leave behind the land of slavery and enter upon a new freedom, like leaving Egypt and setting off for the promised land. Romans chapter 7 wrestles with the question of what happened at Mount Sinai and the problems that resulted, leading to a strange new fulfillment of the law. Romans chapter 8 describes the Christian life in terms of God leading his people home to their inheritance, which turns out to be the whole redeemed creation. And Paul warns against precisely the kind of grumbling of which the Israelites had been guilty. You don't want to go back to slavery, do you? He asks in chapter 8, verse 15. Why has Paul done it like this? I think there are 3 reasons which work together. First, he has not forgotten, even if we may have done, that what God has accomplished in Jesus is the fulfillment of the promises made to Abraham. But in Genesis chapter 15, the chapter Paul expounded in Romans chapter 4, God promised Abraham that after a period of slavery he would lead Israel out and home to their own land. Romans chapters 6, 7, and 8 are a way of saying, this is what God was really promising to Abraham. This is the ultimate fulfillment of the covenant. This is how the world is to be put to rights, as God always intended. Second, many Jews of Paul's day were in fact thinking in terms of a new Exodus, a great new act of God through which Israel would be freed from oppression. Paul agrees with this expectation, but instead of seeing it in terms simply of political freedom from Rome, he translates it into the ultimate freedom, the liberation of the whole cosmos from sin, corruption, and death. Third, he is thereby deliberately highlighting the fact that what God has done in and through Jesus the Messiah is the true fulfillment of the hope of Israel. It is not that Israel and its hope have been left behind as an earlier stage of the plan. On the contrary, the salvation which God has accomplished in the Messiah, the salvation which he will complete by the Spirit, is the goal of all that had gone before. And this, as we shall see at the beginning of chapter 9, raises in the most acute form possible the further question, which has been in Paul's mind since at least the start of chapter 3, what then are we to say about continuing ethnic Israel? Chapters 6, 7, and 8 are thus designed both as a spectacular exposition of the Christian life in their own terms, and as a way of taking forward the thrust of the whole book of which they form a central part. So what is Paul's answer to the extraordinary suggestion in the first verse? What would he say to someone who declared that since God accepts us as we are, it is better not to change the way we are since God has affirmed it as good? His answer is that in becoming a Christian you move from one type of humanity to the other, and you should never think of yourself in the original mode again. More particularly, in becoming a Christian, you die and rise again with the Messiah. Here we meet for the first time in Romans one of Paul's central beliefs, that since the Messiah represents his people, what is true of him is true of them. That is why he speaks of people coming into the Messiah, or being in the Messiah, or of things happening to them with the Messiah. These are not accidental verbal tricks. You cannot substitute the name Jesus for Messiah in sentences like that. Of course, Paul believes that Jesus was and is the Messiah, but my point is that the logic of what he is saying works on the assumption that as Messiah, he is not just a private individual, Jesus of Nazareth, he is the anointed one who sums up his people in himself. More particularly, the act of baptism, which as far as Paul was concerned was the practical and physical beginning of the Christian life, involves the Christian in dying and rising with the Messiah. Here and elsewhere, Paul understands baptism partly in terms of the Exodus to which John's baptism looked back, partly in terms of Jesus' own baptism by John, but more particularly in terms of the baptism of which Jesus himself spoke, Mark chapter 10, verse 38, that is, his death. When people submit to Christian baptism, they die with the Messiah and are raised with him into a new life. This means, first and foremost, a change of status. We are no longer